Alrighty, boys and girls, welcome back to another episode on Cut Rate History. Today we're going to talk about something a little bit different. A couple of conversations I've been having with some folks lately led to the argument of why does the United States stick to the imperial system? And my argument is that it is convenient and practical in the moment. And we'll go over how and why here. But here's a map of who uses what and where. Officially, really, the only countries that use the imperial system are the United States and I believe Liberia and Burma. Could be wrong about that. Um, a lot of countries use a little bit of both, as honestly does the United States. Um, but let's get into it. So, the American system versus the imperial system, they are the same thing. It is just a hiccup that I ran into while I was teaching, where I found that students would mix up the metric and the imperial system and who used them because, honestly, because of the curriculum that the United States has set up for like social studies and history. Because that curriculum so heavily equates imperialism with the British that a lot of kids saw the imperial system and just assumed it's the one that the Americans don't use because our historical curriculum in the U.S. really likes to downplay and kind of deny any historical context that the U.S. has to do with imperialism, regardless of how that. Anyway, different video for a different time. I found that kids associated the imperial system with the British, who don't really use it anymore. So I found myself referring to it as the American system, just for ease of conversation flow. So if you hear me refer to it as that during the video, that's why, and that's where it comes from. Just like a band aid to fix for conversational purposes. Anyways, so where does it come from? A lot of people say it's when you have this conversation of imperial versus metric, the argument against imperial is that it's based on nothing and it comes from nowhere. And why is one, a foot's divided by 12 and a mile is 5,280. None of these are the same. It's hard to remember. Blah 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 blah. So you got to remember this type of measurement system is one of the earliest standardizations, and it needed to be practical and it needed to be able to be used by people who were not very well educated. So really it starts with both a stride and a foot. And a lot of people think, oh, well, a yard comes from the average stride, which happened to be 3 feet. That is also not true. So we're going to start with the foot. It starts, depending on your sources, you could either go with the Romans, which is where I tend to lean, or some sources will point to King Henry I in his era of standardization. For the point of this video, it doesn't really matter. So a foot is based on the average person's foot. It happens to be that length, and for all intents and purposes, it's X length right now. It doesn't matter for us at this moment that it divides into 12 pieces. Where that 12 pieces eventually comes from is the width of the average person's thumb. The average person's thumb becomes an inch. The naming, again, erroneous, doesn't really matter. It so happens that the length of a foot is 12 widths of a thumb. That's why a foot is divided into 12 pieces. That's where that comes from. And a yard actually comes much later, and this one is much more heavily attributed to the British Crown, specifically King Henry I, in that he declared that a yard was the length from his nose to the tip of his outstretched hand. Conveniently, that length is 3 feet for the average person. Really, the average male. If you're anywhere from 5'9" to 6'1" or 2, that's going to be pretty close. If you're a female and shorter, or if you're shorter at all, or taller at all, that will be less true, but on average, it's pretty close. So that's where a yard comes from, but that comes way, 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 way later. So we have these two. We have an inch and a foot, and it's really easy to measure things because you can just use these measurement tools that are just attached to your body. And people use it for mercantile purchases, purposes mostly, trading cloth, fabric, rope, whatever the case may be. The mile comes in and has really nothing to do with feet until math gets to it later, basically. So it comes in with Roman soldiers marching. The Roman soldiers would put mile markers at every 1,000 paces, and the reason that a mile is 5,280 feet is because the average pace of a Roman soldier works out to be 5.28 feet. So the mile measurement came first and then got retroactively applied to feet, if that makes sense. It wasn't that we were going to just take feet and now we need a bigger measurement for distance, so we're going to make it 5,280. That's not how it happened. It's the other way. Chicken or the egg deal kind of here. So that is where a lot of that comes from. And here is I just have it written out. So width of a thumb to the length of a foot. The yard comes much later, even basically after everything else, but from nose to fingertip outstretched, and then a mile is 1,000 strides, and when retroactively applied, you get 5.28 feet roughly per stride. And this makes things relatively easy for everybody, really, to do in practical terms. You can, for a mile, it is, if you've walked, if you've hiked, if you've done anything like that, it is easy to create a mental image of, yeah, that's about 1,000 paces. And then there's your mile. And yeah, well, that length of rope over there looks about, I don't know, 3 or 4 of my feet. And this thread, it works out that way. It works out so that it's easy for the human mind to equate to. Where the metric system comes in is it's much easier to do the math. As I'm sure every one of you know, the metric system is based on tens. It makes the math really easy, which is nice. Everybody likes easy math. But it's harder because those measurements don't have a real world equivalency. They're not, so a centimeter is 2.54 inches. So I got to look and like, oh, that's like 2.5 of my thumbs, blah, 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 blah. It's less practical in the moment. It's more practical for the math. And a great analog to this is Fahrenheit versus Celsius. So kind of the same thing. Fahrenheit is the more practical, real world application to a human being, and Celsius makes the math easier. An easy way to think about this is basically Fahrenheit is how temperature affects the human body, and Celsius is how temperature affects water. So if we just go based on 0 to 100 right here, we'll talk about Celsius first. 0 freezes. That means it's pretty cold for Celsius. At 100, water boils. That's pretty hot for water. And that's nice and easy, 0 to 100. What that means for how it feels for a human being, though, is, it doesn't really make sense. So if we talk about, so water freezes at 32 degrees. What does that really mean? That doesn't mean anything. That's an irrelevant number, effectively. And the same thing for 212 for water boiling. There's no reference point here. However, if you look at it the same way on a scale of 0 to 100, 0 is pretty freaking cold for a human being, and 100 is pretty freaking hot for a human being. So it's just the application. It's not really that one is better than the other. It's that one is better at certain things than the other. Fahrenheit is easier to talk about in terms of like how it feels outside. If it's 0 degrees, it's really cold. If it's 100 degrees, it's really hot. If it's 50 degrees, it's kind of comfortable, maybe a little bit cold. But it's directly in between. It's convenient. When you talk about Celsius, 0 degrees sounds like it would be really cold, and I'm not saying 32 degrees Fahrenheit isn't cold, but it's not, wretched. And the same thing for 100. The 100 doesn't. It's the difference between 100 degrees Celsius and 212 degrees Fahrenheit. Those numbers, they're the same, obviously, but the numbers seem very far off. 212 seems like way more than 100, and in terms of Fahrenheit, it is 212 degrees is unsurvivable for a human. So it's just in terms of practice. It's in terms of what they apply to and what they're easier for. It's not really that one is better. Like I said, it's just they have different applications and they're better at different things. Um, so that's all I wanted to talk about today. I want to give a little bit of history of like where those measurements came from, because a lot of the arguments you hear from people are, it doesn't make sense. Why is it 12 and then 5,280 and then 3 for a yard? And where does all this come from? This is where it comes from. It comes from being able to use your body to make fairly accurate measurements without having to go get a tool to do it. It's just a practical, easier thing. And then as, things start to expand, globalization comes into effect, there's a lot of trade, there's a lot more different kinds of people interacting, and there's a lot more math being done because there's a lot more stuff involved. Yeah, sure, a base of 10 makes the math way easier. But on an individual level, or a village, or a if you're not dealing with a lot of different kinds of things, it's very convenient to be able to use your body as the measuring tool, as opposed to having to carry around a yardstick, a ruler, whatever the case may be. So that's where it comes from. I think like the practical purposes for me outweigh the math purposes. Certainly, now that we're all walking around with calculators in our pockets, it's just convenient. And I also, bias as an American, but I think Fahrenheit is a much improved, improved is the wrong word. It's a much better measurement of temperature, like I said, for human beings. Like if you have a thermometer in your house, I think it should absolutely be in Fahrenheit. But, if you're measuring water or anything else, and any other chemical, anything having to do with chemistry, sure, use Celsius. It's easier. But in terms of the human body, is it cold out? Is it hot out? Do I have to wear pants? Do I need a sweatshirt? Things like that. I think Fahrenheit is is the superior way to go. Let me know what you guys think in the comments down below. Like I said, a little bit shorter, different kind of video today, but it came up actually at work, and I thought it'd be a fun topic to make a video about. If you made it this far, I appreciate you coming out, and I'll catch you in the next one.